The rifle was already in Thomas's hands when he opened the door, but what he saw made his breath catch. A young Lakota girl, barely conscious, half buried in snow. No words, no plea, just eyes full of ghosts. He took her in, lit the fire, and by morning, he was surrounded. Silent warriors, war-painted and unmoving, encircled his cabin like shadows frozen in time. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning, one that would rewrite his life forever. Welcome to MS Incredible Stories. Let's uncover what really happened. The sky was a heavy gray, thick with low-hanging clouds that promised more snow. The cold had settled deep into the bones of the land, wrapping every tree and stone in a brittle stillness. Inside his small cabin, Thomas Kane stood by the window, watching the swirling flakes as they fell steadily, blanketing the earth in white. The winter had been long and harsh, each day stretching endlessly into the next, marked only by the quiet creak of the wind and the occasional call of a distant crow. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls, the only source of warmth against the creeping cold. Thomas's hands were rough and cracked, the lines etched by years of toil on unforgiving soil. His face, weathered and lean, bore the weight of solitude, a loneliness that had settled after his wife's passing 2 winters ago. The loss had hollowed the cabin and the man alike. Nights like this were the hardest, when the silence pressed close and the howling wind seemed to echo the emptiness inside. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a soft, uneven tapping at the door. Thomas's heart tightened, and instinct took hold before reason could intervene. He grabbed the worn hunting rifle resting by the door, moving carefully toward the sound. Outside, the storm swirled, the world reduced to shifting shadows and white. When he opened the door, a young woman crouched there, shivering and nearly buried beneath the snow. Her dark hair was tangled and wet, her clothing torn and stained. She looked up at him with eyes wide and wary, yet there was a flicker of desperate hope within them. Thomas hesitated for only a moment before pulling her inside, closing the door against the wind's cold roar. The fire roared back to life as he wrapped her in a thick blanket, the warmth spreading slowly through her chilled body. She did not speak, but her presence filled the cabin with a sudden urgency, a fragile thread of connection woven between 2 strangers on the edge of a relentless winter's night. The cold bit sharper beneath the towering pines, their dark branches heavy with snow that muffled the world in a thick, frozen silence. The forest held its breath, still and watchful, as the girl had moved beneath its shadowed canopy. Her footsteps, though cautious, left faint imprints on the snow-covered earth, tracing a path marked by desperation and determination. She had come far, crossing frozen rivers and broken trails, guided by instinct more than memory. The bitter wind tugged at her tattered cloak, threatening to strip away what little warmth remained, but she pressed onward, every step carrying the weight of stories left unspoken. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their needles whispering secrets only the wild could understand. By nightfall, the edge of the forest gave way to a clearing where a small cabin sat nestled against the land, smoke curling from its chimney in a thin, steady ribbon. It was a humble place, weathered by years of harsh winters and quiet solitude, but to the girl, it was a beacon, a fragile promise of shelter from the relentless storm. She paused for a moment at the boundary between trees and open sky, her breath steaming in the freezing air. The sound of distant footsteps echoed softly behind her, shadows shifting like ghosts on the snow, but she did not look back. Her focus was fixed on the cabin's warm light, flickering like a heartbeat against the dark. With a final, steadying breath, she stepped forward, her form nearly swallowed by the swirling snowflakes. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble with quiet urgency, as if the land itself recognized the weight of her arrival. She moved with a quiet grace born of hardship, a spirit unbroken despite the scars that marred her skin. That night, beneath the sheltering pines and the cold stare of a winter moon, a stranger crossed into a world she barely understood, carrying with her the fierce silence of survival and the fragile hope of a new beginning. The fire's glow danced across the cabin walls, casting shadows that seemed to carry the weight of years past. Thomas sat in the worn wooden chair, eyes fixed on the flickering flames as memories stirred beneath the surface of his quiet solitude. The room was heavy with the scent of pine smoke and something more, a lingering sorrow that clung to every corner, every breath. He thought of the wife he had lost 2 winters ago, her soft laughter now only a distant echo in the silence. Her presence still haunted the spaces she once filled. The empty chair at the table, the faded quilt folded neatly on the bed, the wildflower she had planted each spring now buried beneath layers of snow. Grief was a constant companion, an unspoken burden that bent his shoulders and dulled the edges of the days. The girl by the hearth seemed to carry her own shadows, silent and deep. Her eyes, though fierce, held a quiet sadness that mirrored his own. Thomas wondered what ghosts trailed behind her, what pain had driven her across frozen lands to seek refuge in his lonely cabin. He felt the fragile thread of connection stretching taut between them, fragile yet unyielding. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows, carrying the mournful song of the winter night. Inside, the cabin held its breath, as if time itself had paused to honor the weight of loss and the fragile hope nestled within the flickering firelight. He reached for a worn photograph on the table, a faded image of a younger self and a smiling woman whose eyes shone with a life he longed to remember. The edges of the photo curled, softened by years of touch and tears. Grief was not just absence. It was memory, a heavy cloak woven with love and loss. In that quiet moment, Thomas understood that the girl's arrival was more than chance. Both carried stories carved from pain and endurance, stories that now intertwined beneath the shelter of this old cabin. The past lingered, but so did the possibility of something new, a fragile promise flickering in the heart of a long winter's night. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost-covered window panes, casting pale patterns across the worn floorboards. The cabin was quiet except for the low crackle of the fire and the soft breaths of 2 figures occupying the small space. Neither spoke, and yet between them hung a fragile truce, an understanding born not of words, but of shared need. Thomas moved about with deliberate care, fetching water from the basin and tending to the fire. The girl watched him, her dark eyes steady but wary, as if measuring the space they both now inhabited. Her hands remained folded in her lap, fingers twisting the edge of the blanket, restless beneath the stillness. He wanted to ask who she was, what had driven her through the bitter cold to his door, but the questions lingered unspoken. Instead, he offered small gestures, a bowl of warm broth, a rough cloth to wipe the dirt from her face, a nod of reassurance. She accepted these tokens without thanks, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavy on her features. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the quiet thread of storms yet to come. Inside, the silence between them was not emptiness but a delicate balance, a space where mistrust and hope coexisted. Neither man nor girl claimed the night's events, but both understood that this moment was a turning point, a choice to hold the fragile peace or let it shatter like brittle ice. As the day wore on, Thomas watched her tend to small tasks around the cabin with careful precision, folding firewood, sweeping ashes, gathering dry herbs from a shelf. Each movement was deliberate, as if staking claim to a place she had yet to call home. In the absence of words, the quiet passed like a fragile treaty, one written in glances and gestures, in the soft exchange of warmth and shelter. 2 strangers, bound by circumstance and unspoken needs, beginning to bridge the chasm between past wounds and the uncertain promise of trust. The truce was silent but powerful, a first step towards something neither dared yet to name. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the cabin's walls. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of unseen sorrows. Inside, the girl sat closer to the hearth, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea Thomas had brewed with dried herbs from the windowsill. Her eyes, once distant and guarded, now held a flicker of something unspoken, memories folded deep beneath layers of silence. The quiet stretched between them until Thomas, sensing the moment's fragile opening, spoke softly. "If you want to, you can tell me what brought you here." She looked up, surprised by the invitation, as if weighing the risk of revealing the past she had tried so hard to bury. Her voice came low, hesitant at first, then steadier, weaving fragments of story both brutal and fragile. She spoke of a village swallowed by flames, of nights shattered by cries and thunder, of families torn apart by men in uniforms bearing no mercy. She spoke of a life once filled with laughter and the wide-open sky, now reduced to shadows and loss. Each word was a shard of pain, a wound reopened beneath the safety of the cabin walls. Thomas listened, the lines in his weathered face deepening with empathy. His own scars echoed in hers. The loss of a wife, the silence left in the wake of grief. Though their worlds were different, the ache was the same. The brutal cost of violence, the fragile hope to survive. She told him of running through forests, through storms, chased by fear and memory alike. The marks on her skin were proof of battles not just fought in war, but in the struggle to reclaim herself. Her name, spoken now for the first time, carried the weight of identity reclaimed, Lakota, fierce and unbroken. As the fire's warmth wrapped around them, the room held a new kind of quiet, one not of distance, but of shared understanding. The wounded past had been revealed, and with it, the fragile bridge toward trust began to take shape. The days that followed slipped by in a rhythm measured less by words and more by small, quiet gestures. Trust was not spoken aloud. It was built slowly, carefully, in moments that passed almost unnoticed but carried immense weight. Thomas rose early each morning, lighting the hearth and moving about the cabin with steady purpose. The girl, whose name he now knew as Ayanna, began to mirror his movements, gathering kindling, fetching water from the frozen well, her hands steady despite the lingering chill in the air. Their shared tasks wove an unspoken connection, each action a thread binding them closer in the cold solitude. At times, they would sit side by the fire, the silence between them comfortable rather than oppressive. Thomas noticed the way Ayanna's eyes softened as she watched the flames dance, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. She began to hum softly in her native tongue, a low, haunting melody that carried the scent of grasslands and rivers, filling the space with a fragile warmth. One afternoon, Thomas found her weaving strips of leather into something delicate yet strong. Without speaking, he offered her a small carved wooden bead, a token from his late wife's belongings. She accepted it with a shy nod, slipping it into the weaving. It was a silent exchange of respect and acknowledgement, a moment where two fractured souls found a way to touch. Outside, the snow continued its slow descent, blanketing the world in white, muffling footsteps and softening harsh edges. Inside, the cabin became a sanctuary from the storm, both the one raging outside and the ones carried within their hearts. Trust did not come in grand declarations or promises. It grew in the quiet moments, the shared meals, the exchanged glances, the mutual care. It was the understanding that they were no longer alone in the cold, that the presence of another soul could begin to thaw the frozen past and kindle a fragile hope for what lay ahead. The wind carried a hollow sound through the trees, as if the very earth mourned battles long past, yet never fully laid to rest. Thomas sat outside the cabin, the rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the distant horizon where the snow met the sky in an endless, cold blur. The weight of history pressed down like the heavy clouds above, unseen but ever present. Ayanna approached quietly, her steps soft on the frozen ground. She settled beside him without a word, the silence between them filled with memories neither could fully voice. She touched the worn leather of the rifle, her fingers tracing the grooves worn by time and use. This world, she said softly in her clear voice, carries the wounds of many. Thomas nodded, thinking of the wars he had fought, the battles that left scars deeper than any wound, battles fought not only on fields but in the hearts of men and nations. He remembered the faces of friends lost, the long nights spent in trenches, and the bitter grief that followed like a shadow. Ayanna spoke of her own struggles, the fight for survival amid displacement and loss, the broken treaties, and the silent sorrow of a people forced from their lands. Her words were fragments, but each carried the weight of generations. "We are all bound by stories we did not choose," she said. The cold seemed to deepen around them, as if the echoes of forgotten battles still whispered in the wind. Yet, in that shared stillness, something fragile and unbroken remained, a connection forged not by violence but by understanding. Two souls carrying the heavy burdens of history, yet seeking a way forward beyond the pain. Thomas lifted a small carved token from his pocket, a keepsake from the past, and placed it gently in Ayanna's hand. She accepted it with a quiet grace, the gesture speaking volumes beyond words. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, the echoes of battles past settled into a solemn peace, marking the beginning of a fragile truce, not just between two strangers, but between worlds striving to heal. The morning air was crisp and sharp, each breath forming a pale mist that lingered briefly before fading into the cold. Outside the cabin, the snow stretched in a pristine blanket, untouched except for a trail of footprints that led away from the door. Thomas traced the path with his eyes, uneven, cautious, yet deliberate. Ayanna stepped beside him, her gaze following the same tracks with a quiet intensity. "They came last night," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of warning and remembrance. The prints were larger, deeper, and spoke of many, riders moving through the storm with purpose and silence. Thomas's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his shoulder. The footprints were a reminder that the fragile peace they had found was tenuous, easily shattered by the approaching presence of the past. He felt the familiar knot of tension settle in his chest, the cold that no fire could thaw. Ayanna knelt, examining the impressions carefully. "They circle us," she said. "Silent watchers, waiting. They do not come as friends." Her eyes met Thomas's, fierce and steady. The unspoken understanding between them grew heavier. Inside, the cabin seemed suddenly smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of the threat outside. But despite the danger, neither spoke of fear. Instead, they moved with quiet determination, preparing the hearth, securing the windows, gathering supplies. Each act was a small defiance against the looming shadow. As the day wore on, the footprints became more than just marks in the snow. They were a message, a reminder that choices carried consequences, and that survival demanded more than shelter. It required courage and resolve. When twilight bled across the sky, Thomas and Ayanna stood side by side at the edge of the clearing. The footprints led toward the horizon, where the silhouettes of riders appeared against the fading light, silent, watchful, and many. The world held its breath, caught between the stillness of snow and the storm of what was to come. In that moment, footprints in the snow were not just traces of passage, but the beginning of a reckoning neither could escape. A low rumble echoed across the frozen plains, distant but growing, a sound that stirred the air like a gathering storm. Thomas stood at the cabin's door, his breath catching as he watched the horizon where dark shapes moved steadily against the fading light. The rhythmic thunder of hooves drummed through the cold, a pulse that quickened the heart and tightened the throat. Ayanna joined him silently, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the advancing riders. Their numbers were many, dozens mounted in a formation both deliberate and unyielding. Painted faces, feathers braided into manes, and weapons held but not raised. They moved with the quiet certainty of those who claimed the land as their own. The wind carried their presence, a scent of earth and sweat and ancient resolve. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down, the unspoken stories of conflict and kinship woven into the very soil beneath their feet. This was no random visitation. It was a summons, a reckoning. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered uncertainly as the shadows grew longer. The fragile calm that had settled between Thomas and Ayanna now trembled on the edge of confrontation. Neither spoke. Words would be hollow against the language of silence and steel. Ayanna's hand found his, steady and sure. "They come as watchers, not warriors," she said softly. "But their eyes hold the thunder of what may come." Thomas nodded, feeling a strange mixture of fear and resolve. The gathering thunder was more than sound. It was a warning that the past was not done with them, that the choices made in silence would soon be answered in the open. As the riders closed the distance, the sky darkened with rolling clouds, the first drops of rain mingling with the snow already fallen. The world seemed to hold its breath, caught between the cold and the storm, the old wounds and the hope for peace. In that moment, beneath the gathering distant thunder, two worlds poised on the edge of change, waiting for the first word to break the silence. At first light, the world was hushed beneath a pale, gray sky. The snow lay undisturbed, except for the faint marks of hooves that encircled the cabin like a silent ring. Thomas stood just inside the doorway, watching as the riders had formed their quiet perimeter overnight, an unspoken barrier that both protected and contained. Ayanna moved beside him, her breath steady despite the weight settling in her chest. The circle was more than a physical boundary. It was a statement, a watchful presence that needed no words. The warriors sat unmoving, their faces painted with solemn colors that told stories older than the land itself. Their eyes held a fierce calm, a patience that bore the tension of generations. The cold air carried a stillness that felt both sacred and charged, as if the very earth was listening. Thomas felt the heavy gaze of those beyond the ring, a mix of judgment and curiosity aimed not just at him, but the girl who had sought refuge beneath his roof. Inside, the cabin seemed smaller, the warmth of the fire unable to fully ward off the chill that crept from the surrounding silence. Ayanna stood near the hearth, her posture straight, her hands folded. Though her face showed no fear, Thomas could sense the turmoil beneath her calm exterior, a storm held tightly at bay. The morning stretched on, time marked only by the slow drift of snowflakes and the unyielding presence of the watchers outside. Neither side spoke, the silence heavy with meaning and unspoken challenges. Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over Ayanna's. It was a gesture of solidarity, a quiet promise that she was not alone in this circle of uncertainty. As the dawn deepened, the silent circle remained unbroken, a fragile moment suspended between worlds. It was a standoff without violence, a meeting of old wounds and new beginnings, where trust hung in the balance, and every heartbeat echoed the hope for peace amidst the cold light of a wary dawn. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds as the figure atop the lead horse slowly detached from the silent circle. Draped in a cloak of black wolf fur, the chief's presence commanded the frozen clearing without a word. His face, painted with streaks of red like war tears, held an expression carved from years of hardship and ancient wisdom. Every eye among the riders was fixed on the cabin where Thomas and Ayanna waited. Thomas stepped forward, his breath visible in the icy air, feeling the weight of the chief's gaze settle on him like a tangible force. The man's eyes were deep pools of shadow and fire, seeing beyond the surface to the truths held within. Thomas met that gaze steadily, neither bowing nor challenging, but standing with the quiet strength of one who had faced loss and hardship. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, her figure steady and unflinching beside Thomas. Her dark eyes locked with the chief's, fierce and unwavering. The air between them crackled with a silent history, unspoken questions and answers carried in the stillness. The chief's glance lingered on her, measuring, weighing the woman who had returned to the land that had shaped her ancestors. No words were spoken at first, only the sound of hooves shifting in the snow and the whisper of wind threading through the pines. Then the chief dismounted with deliberate grace, snow crunching beneath his boots as he approached. Each step was measured, purposeful, a man walking between worlds, between old grievances and fragile hope. Thomas felt the pulse of time stretch taut, the moment heavy with meaning. The chief's gaze met his once more, searching for the truth behind the shelter offered and the choice made. There was no anger, no accusation, only the weight of a legacy that demanded respect and reckoning. In that charged stillness, the first fragile bridge between two lives began to take shape, not with words, but with the unyielding power of a gaze that saw beyond fear to the possibility of understanding. Ayanna stepped forward before Thomas could find words that might falter under the chief's steady gaze. Her voice, quiet but resolute, broke the heavy silence that hung between the two men. "Father," she said simply, the single word carrying the weight of years and unspoken defiance. The chief's eyes remained fixed on her, a deep well of emotion unreadable but fierce. The riders behind him shifted slightly, their quiet strength forming an unbreakable wall of tradition and expectation. Yet in that moment, the space between father and daughter was filled not with anger, but with a fragile tension, one born from love, duty, and the hard truth of choice. Thomas watched as Ayanna stood tall, her shoulders squared against the burden of the past. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled through the storm, but a woman shaped by survival and the fierce need for freedom. Her gaze held something unyielding, a declaration that the life she sought was not one written by others, but one she would claim herself. The chief's voice finally broke the silence, low and steady. "You have returned without permission," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "You belong to this land, to our people. Your path is not yours alone to choose." Ayanna's reply was calm, each word deliberate and clear. "I belong to myself," she said. "I chose to come here, to stay here, not as property, but as a person. My journey is mine." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle in the frozen air. The daughter's choice was more than a defiance of tradition. It was a claim to agency, a challenge to the old ways that sought to bind her. The chief's gaze softened, just for a moment, as if recognizing the fierce spirit that no chain could hold. The silent circle waited, the frozen land holding its breath, as the first cracks of change began to form, not with violence, but with the quiet courage of a daughter's choice. The cold air hung heavy with tension as the chief took a slow step closer to Thomas and Ayanna. The wind whispered through the pines like a mournful chant, carrying the weight of generations bound by blood and unbroken promises. The moment stretched taut between them, an unspoken reckoning where tradition met choice and honor demanded its due. The chief's eyes bore into Thomas's with a piercing steadiness, reading past the worn face and steady hands to the heart beneath. "You took her," the chief said, his voice low but resolute. It was not an accusation, but a statement heavy with expectation and challenge. Thomas met the gaze without flinching. "I did not take her," he replied quietly. "She came to me, seeking shelter and safety. I offered what I could, nothing more." His words were simple, but carried the weight of a man who had known loss and sacrifice. Ayanna stood between them, her presence a shield and a declaration. "I chose to walk this path," she said firmly, "not as a possession, but as a person with my own voice." Her eyes flicked to the chief, unyielding and fierce. The chief's hand rose slowly, not in anger, but in a gesture of measurement. He touched Ayanna's chin gently, a silent acknowledgement of her strength and the bond forged in shared trials. "Blood binds us," he said softly, "but so does choice. The bond between you is not easily broken, nor lightly made." He stepped back, his gaze sweeping the assembled riders who remained still as shadows. "You will prove yourself," the chief declared, "not with words, but with honor. One hunt, one deer, walk the path without faltering, and we will know the measure of the man who stands with my daughter." Thomas felt the weight of the challenge settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a chance for reckoning. The air was thick with expectation, the fragile thread of trust woven tight between blood and bond. In the silent clearing beneath the cold sky, the reckoning had begun, where past and future converged in the test of courage, honor, and choice. The sun hung low over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Thomas and the chief rode side by side, their horses moving steadily through the quiet landscape. The tension of the past days hung lightly now, replaced by a solemn respect born of shared purpose. This was no ordinary journey. It was a crossing of paths forged by fate and bound by honor. The chief's eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and unwavering, while Thomas absorbed the weight of the moment. He was a man unaccustomed to ceremonies or tests of worth, yet he felt the undeniable gravity of this hunt, not just as a measure of skill, but as a passage into a world that demanded understanding beyond words. Ayanna followed behind, her presence a silent reminder of the trust placed in Thomas and the fragile hope that wove their lives together. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, mingling with the quiet sounds of hooves and soft murmurs of the land awakening beneath winter's hold. They reached a narrow ravine where tracks of deer marked the snow, fresh and deliberate. The chief dismounted, his movements fluid and practiced, gesturing for Thomas to do the same. "This path," he said quietly, "is more than a trail. It is a test of patience, respect, and connection with the land." Thomas nodded, feeling the unfamiliar weight of reverence settle in his chest. As they moved carefully through the brush, he recalled stories of his own ancestors, men who had fought and survived through courage, but also through humility and respect for the world around them. The sun dipped lower, bathing the valley in golden light as a lone buck emerged, cautious and regal. Thomas raised his bow with steady hands, every breath measured. He let the arrow fly, the quiet release echoing through the stillness. The deer fell cleanly, a testament to honor and skill. The chief's eyes met his, approval and acknowledgement shining in their depths. "You walked the path without faltering," the chief said. "Today, fate and honor have crossed for both our sakes." In that shared moment beneath the fading light, old divides softened and new bonds took root, paths converging toward a future shaped by respect and choice. The morning air was crisp, the sky a pale canvas streaked with the soft glow of dawn. Thomas stood beside the chief at the edge of the forest, their horses tethered nearby, their breath rising in gentle clouds. The trial of the hunt was not merely a test of skill, but a rite steeped in meaning, a bridge between worlds that demanded respect, patience, and honor. The chief's eyes held steady, unblinking, as he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of generations. "The hunt is a way to walk with the land, to listen with more than ears, and see with more than eyes. It is a sacred path." Thomas nodded, the gravity of the moment settling deep in his chest. He had faced battles before, but none that asked so much of the spirit as this. The bow in his hands felt both foreign and familiar, a tool connecting past and present, man and nature. Ayanna watched silently from the cabin's edge, her presence a quiet blessing and a reminder of the stakes. The trial was as much for Thomas as for the bond they sought to forge, the acceptance of a man who had offered sanctuary and stood ready to prove his honor. Together, Thomas and the chief moved through the trees, footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of snow. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every rustle and distant call a message waiting to be understood. Thomas felt the sharp sting of cold but pushed it aside, focusing on the rhythm of the hunt, the patience, the stillness, the respect. Then, through a clearing, the buck appeared, a graceful creature, alert and wary. Thomas steadied his aim, heart pounding not with fear but reverence. The arrow flew, a swift and silent promise, striking true. The chief's gaze met Thomas's, a slow nod of approval bridging the silence. The trial was past, not in dominance, but in harmony with the land and its laws. As they returned, the bond between men and land, and between strangers bound by trust, grew stronger, forged in the sacred fire of the hunt and the quiet power of honor fulfilled. The days that followed the hunt carried a new rhythm, one shaped by quiet lessons whispered by the land itself. Thomas and Ayanna moved together through the rolling hills and wooded valleys, learning to read the subtle signs hidden beneath snow and stone. The earth spoke in ways unfamiliar to Thomas, but each discovery was a step toward understanding. Ayanna showed him how to track the soft impressions left by rabbits and deer, how to recognize the brittle shapes of plants that held life beneath winter's grip. Her hands were sure and steady as she demonstrated knots for snares and shelter, her voice low and patient, carrying the cadence of a language older than words. Thomas found himself humbled by the land's quiet teachings, how the wind could carry stories, how the footprints of animals told of hunger, fear, and survival. The forest was no longer a backdrop, but a living presence, a teacher demanding respect and careful attention. At night, they sat by the fire, the flames casting warm light over maps drawn in the dirt and bones carefully cleaned. Ayanna's stories wove through the smoke, the myths and histories of her people, tales of harmony and hardship tied to the cycles of the seasons and the heartbeat of the earth. Thomas shared his own stories, too, of battles fought in distant places, of loss and longing, of the silence that followed grief. Their words met in the space between them, bridging worlds once divided. The lessons from the land went beyond survival. They were lessons of patience, of listening, and of trust, not only in nature, but in one another. Each day brought a deeper connection, the fragile bond between settler and Lakota growing stronger beneath open skies and ancient trees. In this shared journey, Thomas discovered that the land could heal wounds unseen, and that in learning its secrets, he was learning a new way to live, with honor, humility, and hope rooted in the earth beneath their feet. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, the air thickening as a storm brewed beyond the distant hills. Inside the cabin, the fire's warmth flickered against the cold shadows, but Thomas could feel a different kind of storm rising within, a tempest of doubt, fear, and unresolved grief. The peace they had built felt fragile, threatened not just by the weather, but by the weight each carried in silence. Ayanna sat near the hearth, her eyes distant, as if searching for something lost in the swirling smoke. Thomas watched her, sensing the battle beneath her calm exterior, the memories she held tight, the scars that time had yet to soothe. The girl who had arrived, shivering in the snow, was now a woman caught between worlds, her heart torn by loyalty, loss, and the uncertain future ahead. His own thoughts churned with questions he dared not voice. Was he strong enough to protect her? Was the sanctuary he offered truly safe? The wounds of his past, the wife lost, the silence that followed, echoed louder in the storm's gathering roar. The fear of losing again gnawed at him like the biting wind outside. Ayanna's voice finally broke through the stillness, soft but steady. "The storm inside us," she said, "is harder to weather than any winter." Her gaze met his, fierce and vulnerable all at once. "But storms pass if we hold steady." Thomas nodded, the truth in her words settling like rain on dry earth. They had both carried storms, some seen, others hidden deep beneath the surface. But here, in the fragile warmth of the cabin, they found a way to face the tempest together. Outside, thunder rumbled, distant but insistent, a reminder that life's trials often come without warning. Inside, two hearts beat in quiet defiance against the storm, learning that strength was not the absence of fear, but the courage to endure it side by side. The fire's glow softened the edges of the cabin, casting a gentle light on faces marked by fatigue and unspoken thoughts. Thomas and Ayanna sat opposite each other, the silence between them dense yet oddly comforting. Words hovered just beyond reach, things neither dared to say aloud but both deeply felt. Thomas looked toward the window, watching the snow swirl against the dark sky. Memories pressed against his mind, losses too heavy to carry alone, regrets too sharp to voice. He longed to share the weight, but found the right words elusive, tangled in grief and fear. Ayana's gaze rested on the flickering flames, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She too carried stories held close, truths that had been shaped by pain and survival. Her silence was not absence, but a shield, protecting both herself and the fragile trust growing between them. In the quiet, a breath shared, a glance held longer than necessary, spoke volumes. The space between them became a sanctuary where understanding needed no language, where presence was enough to bridge the distance. Thomas finally broke the stillness with a low murmur. "Some things are too heavy to say." Ayana nodded, her eyes meeting his, reflecting a shared understanding. The past, with all its shadows, did not need to be spoken to be felt. They leaned closer, the warmth of the fire mirrored in their steady breathing. The unspoken words were woven into the silence, a tapestry of pain, hope, and tentative trust. Neither rushed to fill the void, knowing that healing often began in the quiet spaces. Outside, the storm had softened to a gentle whisper, the snow settling quietly over the earth. Inside, two souls sat together in the glow of fading light, bound not by declarations but by the profound weight of words left unspoken, and the promise that someday, perhaps, they would find the courage to voice them. The first thaw of spring touched the land with gentle hands, melting the heavy snow into trickling streams that sang of renewal. The air was crisp but carried a different kind of warmth, a promise whispered by budding branches and the soft hum of awakening life. Thomas stood on the porch, watching as the world shifted from frozen stillness to tentative movement. Ayana moved beside him, her eyes bright with a hope that had long been buried beneath winter's weight. The shawl she wore was lighter now, stitched with threads of blue, a symbol woven from the fabric Thomas had brought, a gift from a past slowly healing. Together, they faced a future not defined by loss or fear, but by the fragile freedom they had fought to claim. The promise of spring was more than a change of season. It was a rebirth of possibility. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, the heavy silence lifted by the chorus of returning birds and the gentle rustle of grass beneath soft breezes. The world was no longer a frozen cage, but a canvas waiting for new stories. Thomas reached for Ayana's hand, the gesture simple but profound. In that touch lay a covenant of trust, respect, and the freedom to choose their own path. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held dominion over their days. They spoke little, words unnecessary beneath the vast sky stretching endlessly above. Instead, they moved with a quiet determination, tending the land, rebuilding what winter had worn, and planting seeds not just in soil but in the space between them. The promise of spring carried the weight of freedom. Freedom to live, to love, and to create a life shaped not by chains or silence, but by choice and consent. It was a delicate hope, yet fiercely alive. As the sun rose higher, casting gold across the prairie, Thomas and Ayana stood together, rooted in the earth and in each other, a testament to endurance, to the power of healing, and to the promise of new beginnings waiting just beyond the thaw. The wind carried faint echoes across the open prairie, whispers of voices long past, mingling with the present in a timeless conversation. Thomas and Ayana stood at the edge of a clearing, the sun casting soft light on the grasses that swayed gently, as if responding to the stories carried on the breeze. Ayana closed her eyes, listening not just with her ears but with a deeper part of herself, one attuned to the voices of ancestors, to the rhythms of the land that had witnessed countless lives and histories. The stories were woven into the earth beneath their feet, in the scars of the hills and the curve of the river. Thomas watched her, feeling the weight of that connection, an understanding that stretched beyond words and generations. He thought of his own history, of battles fought and peace sought, of love lost and found in the quiet moments that followed. The past was not a distant shadow, but a living presence shaping every step forward. They spoke softly then, sharing memories and hopes. Ayanna recounted the teachings passed down through her people, lessons of balance, respect, and resilience. Thomas shared the stories of his own ancestors, of a world shaped by struggle, but also by enduring hope. Their voices blended with the wind, a bridge between past and present, between two lives entwined by fate and choice. The land seemed to listen, holding their stories in its embrace. Around them, signs of renewal blossomed, wildflowers breaking through thawed soil, birds returning to build nests, the river's song growing stronger with each passing day. The voices of the past whispered encouragement, while the present offered the chance to write new chapters. In this shared moment, Thomas and Ayanna found solace and strength, knowing that while history carried its burdens, it also carried the seeds of healing. Together, they embraced the voices that had shaped them, ready to add their own to the ever-flowing story of the land and its people. The evening settled softly over the prairie, painting the sky with hues of deep purple and fading gold. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting gentle light on faces worn by struggle, yet softened by something new, an unspoken defiance that glowed quietly between Thomas and Ayanna. They sat close, but not touching, the space between them charged with the fragile power of a bond forged in hardship and hope. Love here was not loud or grand. It was a steady flame, a quiet rebellion against the wounds of the past and the constraints of expectation. Ayanna's eyes met Thomas's across the room, a spark of resilience shining in their depths. She had chosen this path, not out of necessity, but from a fierce will to claim her own story. In the stillness, their shared glance said what words could not, a promise to stand together, against judgment, against history's weight. Outside, the night wrapped the world in silence, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the trees. It was a silence filled with understanding, where two souls found strength not in defiance shouted from rooftops, but in the steady courage of presence and choice. Thomas reached out slowly, his hand hovering before resting lightly over hers. The touch was gentle, a tether in a world that had too often demanded separation. Their fingers intertwined, a quiet rebellion against loneliness and fear. Love here was a sanctuary, a space carved from trust and respect, a refusal to be defined by past sorrow or others' expectations. It was the courage to build something new, fragile yet unbreakable. In the firelight's soft glow, Thomas and Ayanna embraced the quiet defiance of their love, a testament to the power of choosing one another and the unyielding strength found in simply being together against all odds. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin window, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings and the two figures beginning their day together. Thomas moved with a newfound purpose, the weight of past burdens easing as hope took root. Beside him, Ayanna moved with quiet grace, her presence a steady anchor in the shifting world. Together, they set about tending the land and the home, mending fences worn by winter, clearing pathways through the thawing earth, and planting seeds that promised new life. Each task was a step towards something larger than survival. It was the act of building a sanctuary shaped by choice, respect, and love. The chains of history and hardship that had bound them began to loosen, not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of care and commitment. Walls that once held only silence now echoed with soft laughter and shared stories. The cabin, once a refuge from loss, grew into a home alive with possibility. Neighbors from the nearby settlement began to notice the change. The quiet man who had once kept to himself now greeted others with a steady gaze and a cautious smile. Ayanna's strength and resilience earned quiet respect, her hands skilled in weaving and tending, her spirit unyielding. Yet it was not just a physical place that was being built, but a life free from the shadows of claim and possession. Here, they crafted a future defined by mutual consent and shared dreams, breaking free from the chains of expectation that had sought to define them. As the sun climbed higher, warming the earth and hearts alike. Thomas and Ayanna stood side by side, looking out over the land that had witnessed their journey. The path ahead remained uncertain, but the foundation was solid, rooted in trust, watered by courage, and built with hands that chose to stay. In this place they forged together, breaking chains and building home. They found not just shelter, but the promise of belonging, an enduring testament to the power of love and the freedom it could create. The sun hung warm and steady over the prairie, its golden light spilling across fields that had begun to burst with new life. Thomas stood outside the cabin, the worn leather of his boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. Beside him, Ayanna moved with quiet purpose, her hands steady as she tended to a small patch of freshly planted herbs. Seasons had shifted since the harsh winter had tested their resolve, and with each passing day, their roots grew deeper, not just in the soil beneath their feet, but in the life they had chosen to build together. The cabin no longer stood as a mere refuge from storms, but as a home, filled with the warmth of shared mornings, whispered dreams, and the steady rhythm of healing. Ayanna's shawl, now woven with threads of blue and earth tones, fluttered gently in the breeze, a symbol of her journey, of survival, choice, and belonging. Thomas watched her, the lines of his weathered face softening as hope bloomed where grief had once settled. Neighbors came and went, their eyes less guarded, their smiles warmer, drawn by the quiet strength emanating from the pair. The land itself seemed to respond, grass greener, streams fuller, the sky wider, a reflection of new beginnings. Inside, tokens of the past and promises for the future rested side by side. A carved necklace from Ayanna's people, a photograph of Thomas's wife, the mingling of histories that had shaped but no longer defined them. Their story was no longer one of loss, but of roots deepened in new soil. Together, they faced whatever lay ahead with a steady resolve, bound by love, forged in hardship, and tempered by trust. The storm had passed, the echoes of the past softened by time, and in the stillness of the prairie, two lives had found their place, anchored, flourishing, free. In the gentle embrace of this new soil, Thomas and Ayanna grew not just as individuals, but as a testament to resilience, choice, and the enduring power of home.